You know what's wild about history? Sometimes the greatest empires aren't built by visionaries with master plans and grand strategies written in leather-bound books. Sometimes they're born from complete chaos, from the smoking ashes of someone else's empire that got absolutely demolished. And I'm talking about one of the most ironic, darkly funny twists in all of human history. Picture this exact scene. It's June 26th, 1243. Dawn breaks blood red over a mountain pass in eastern Anatolia called Köse, which translates ominously as beardless mountain. The air is already thick with suffocating summer heat. Dust hangs like a golden veil over two massive armies, preparing to collide in a battle that will echo through 6 centuries. On one side, 80,000 men. Seljuk Turks in gleaming mail. Byzantine mercenaries who remember when their empire controlled this land. Georgian knights in heavy plate armor. Arab warriors from Syria. Frankish crusader knights seeking gold and glory. This is the combined might of the civilized Islamic world in Anatolia. A multinational coalition that speaks a dozen languages. Their armor glints like scattered jewels across the valley floor. Their numbers seem overwhelming, unstoppable, destiny itself. On the other side, 30,000 Mongol horsemen. Outnumbered nearly 3 to 1. Most people would look at those odds and think the Mongols were doomed, that this was suicide, that they'd made a fatal miscalculation. Those people would be catastrophically, spectacularly wrong. Because what happened on that mountain pass didn't just decide a battle. It didn't just end an empire that had ruled for 2 centuries. It accidentally created one of the greatest powers in human history. An empire that would conquer Constantinople, terrify Europe for centuries, and reshape 3 continents. And the Mongols, the guys who won this fight, who executed one of history's most perfect tactical victories, they had absolutely no idea what they were setting in motion. This is the story of how destruction creates opportunity, how chaos breeds power. How the Mongols came to Anatolia to establish order, to impose their will, to make vassals obey, and instead shattered everything so completely that it gave birth to the Ottoman Empire. The battle nobody remembers created the empire nobody could forget. Before we dive into this insane story of unintended consequences, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and smash the like for Map Room Battles. Trust me, you're going to want to catch the next video because history is absolutely full of these wild domino effects where one empire's victory plants the seeds of its own replacement. Seriously, subscribe right now because what I'm about to show you is going to blow your mind. This story has everything: massive armies, catastrophic defeats, brilliant tactics, political intrigue, cultural ironies, and consequences that lasted 600 years, all because nobody could predict what chaos would create. All right, let's go back to June 1243 and watch an empire die so another could be born from its corpse. The stakes here, everything. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum wasn't just another medieval kingdom squabbling over territory. It was the bridge between East and West, the anchor of Islamic civilization in Anatolia, the gateway controlling trade routes worth absolute fortunes in silk and spices. Lose this battle, lose this empire, and you don't just lose land or gold. You lose order itself. You unleash chaos. And chaos as it turns out, is exactly what the world needed, though nobody knew it, for the Ottomans to rise from nothing to something to everything. To understand how spectacularly everything fell apart, you need to know what was about to break. And I mean really understand it, in visceral detail. Because the Seljuk Sultanate wasn't some weak, declining state, waiting passively to collapse like a rotting tree. This was a powerhouse at the height of its civilization, and what happened to it should absolutely terrify anyone who thinks empires are permanent or that power is forever. For nearly 2 centuries, almost 200 years, the Seljuk Turks had been the undisputed masters of Anatolia. Ever since that legendary, game-changing victory at Manzikert in 1071, when they crushed the Byzantine Empire in a single afternoon and sent the Greeks reeling back to Constantinople in humiliating defeat. The Seljuks had ruled this land like absolute kings, their Sultanate of Rum, meaning Rome, because they saw themselves as the rightful heirs to Roman Anatolia. The legitimate successors to ancient imperial glory was prosperous, sophisticated, culturally advanced, militarily powerful. Cities like Konya and Sivas thrived with populations in the tens of thousands. Merchants grew obscenely rich on Silk Road trade, moving precious Chinese silk and exotic Indian spices through bustling Anatolian markets where deals worth kingdoms changed hands. Poets composed exquisite verses in Persian that are still read and studied today. Architects built magnificent monuments, mosques with soaring domes, madrasas where scholars debated philosophy, caravanserais where merchants rested, structures that still stand centuries later as beautiful, haunting testaments to a civilization at its absolute peak. The Sultan in 1243 was a man named Kekusra II, and he was everything a medieval ruler shouldn't be. Young, maybe in his 30s. Impulsive, making decisions based on emotion rather than strategy. Convinced of his own invincibility, surrounded by yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. He'd inherited a stable, well-governed kingdom from his careful, diplomatic father Kaikubad I. His father had understood perfectly how to navigate the treacherous waters of 13th century geopolitics, pay tribute when absolutely necessary, fight when conditions are advantageous. Never, ever provoke enemies you cannot definitively defeat. It was a survival strategy that had kept the Sultanate strong. Kekusra II had inherited his father's throne and treasury and army. He hadn't inherited his father's wisdom, passions, or strategic sense. He was about to inherit a catastrophe entirely of his own making, because to the east, beyond the mountains, beyond the high plateau, a shadow had been steadily growing for years, a darkness spreading like ink across the map. The Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan himself was long dead by 1243. He died back in 1227, 16 years earlier. But his legacy was very much alive, hungry, expanding like a cancer across the known world. His generals and descendants had already conquered Persia, devastated Central Asia, and turned the great Khwarezmian Empire into nothing but a memory and a warning to other kingdoms. The stories that filtered back to Anatolia from those brutal conquests were the stuff of absolute nightmares that made children cry and warriors pale. Cities besieged with methodical patience and then destroyed so completely that grass grew where buildings had stood. Populations slaughtered wholesale every man, woman, and child, or enslaved and marched away in chains. pyramids of skulls left as monuments to Mongol power, warnings visible for miles. Entire ancient dynasties erased from history as if they'd never existed. The Mongols reached Anatolia's eastern borders in the 1230s, a decade before our battle. At first, the relationship was almost cordial, in that careful way that predator and prey can coexist when the predator isn't particularly hungry yet and the prey knows its place. The Seljuks paid modest tribute, some gold, some silk, fine horses. They sent diplomatic gifts. They acknowledged Mongol supremacy in that careful, elaborate diplomatic language that lets everyone save face while avoiding actual military submission. The Mongol general in the region, a capable commander named Shormakhan, seemed relatively content with this arrangement. He had bigger immediate concerns conquering resistant Georgia, subduing mountainous Armenia, consolidating Mongol control over the wild Caucasus region. An uneasy peace held between predator and prey. But Khusraw II didn't want peace, didn't understand diplomacy's value. Or maybe he didn't comprehend what he was risking by breaking the arrangement. Or maybe, and this is probably closest to the brutal truth, he was surrounded by young, ambitious advisors who told him exactly what he wanted to hear rather than what he desperately needed to know. When Khormakhan died in 1241, his replacement was a hardened general named Baiju Noyan. And Baiju was completely done with diplomatic niceties and careful arrangements. The great Khan Ogedai had also died in 1241, and in the power vacuum that followed at the Mongol capital, commanders in distant fields had more autonomy, more freedom to pursue aggressive policies. Baiju looked coldly at the situation in Anatolia with a professional soldier's eye and decided it was time to make the Seljuks truly submit, not just with tribute payments and polite letters, but with absolute, humiliating obedience that left zero doubt who the masters were and who the servants were. His demands were crystal clear and deliberately, calculatedly insulting to royal dignity. Khusraw had to travel to Mongolia in person, across thousands of dangerous miles, to pay homage directly to the great Khan. Not send an ambassador with gifts. Go himself. Prostrate himself physically before Mongol authority. Kiss the ground. Admit vassalage. He had to send hostages, princes of the royal blood, his own sons or brothers, to the Mongol capital to guarantee good behavior and ensure he wouldn't rebel. And most humiliating of all, he had to accept Mongol officials called Darughachi into his court to oversee tax collection and ensure compliance with every Mongol demand. These weren't advisors. These were administrators with veto power over Seljuk decisions. Men who would control the purse strings, who would report everything back to the Mongol capital, who would be the real power behind the Sultan's throne. These weren't polite requests or diplomatic suggestions. They were commands issued to a subordinate expected to obey without question. And Khusraw, surrounded by young nobles as hot-headed and proud as himself, made a catastrophically stupid decision that would doom his empire and everyone in it. He refused. Flat out, unequivocally, publicly refused. Maybe he genuinely thought the Mongols were overextended militarily. After all, they were simultaneously fighting in distant China, in frozen Russia, in resistant Persia. How much attention and how many troops could they possibly spare for Anatolia? Maybe he believed his own propaganda about Seljuk military might and superiority. His father had won impressive battles, expanded the Sultanate's borders dramatically. The Seljuk army had a fearsome reputation. Maybe he was just too young, too proud to bend the knee, too arrogant to understand that pride is a luxury empires can't always afford, that sometimes survival requires swallowing humiliation. Whatever his reasoning, whatever his advisors told him, he picked a fight with the most lethal military machine on the planet. He challenged the descendants of Genghis Khan. Baiju's response was methodical, terrifying, and designed to send a message written in blood. In the winter of 1242 to 1243, his Mongol army appeared suddenly before the massive walls of Erzurum, a major fortified city in eastern Anatolia, one of the Sultanate's most important strongholds and trading centers. He sent formal envoys with a simple, stark message: surrender the city immediately or be destroyed completely. The governor of Erzurum, a brave but foolish man named Yakut, didn't just refuse the demand. He insulted the Mongol ambassadors to their faces, mocked them as barbarians, sent them away with threats and curses. Big mistake. Huge, fatal mistake that would cost thousands of lives. The Mongols besieged Erzurum with 12 massive catapults, siege engines that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds with devastating accuracy. They pounded the walls day and night, methodically, patiently, never rushing, never stopping. Simultaneously, they cut off all supply routes to the city, strangling it slowly. In just 2 months, 60 days of relentless siege, the city fell. What happened next was a message written in blood and screams, a lesson taught through terror that echoed across Anatolia and made entire kingdoms tremble. The population was systematically slaughtered. Not just soldiers who had resisted, not just the governor who had insulted them. Everyone. Men, women, children. The Mongols wanted to make an unforgettable example, to teach a lesson about the cost of defiance. Buildings were razed to their foundations. Churches and mosques alike were torn down methodically, their treasures looted, their sacred spaces desecrated. The city that had stood for centuries, that had seen Roman legions and Arab conquests and Byzantine restorations, became a smoking, corpse-filled ruin in weeks. Survivors who managed to flee carried horrifying stories of Mongol cruelty that made children wake, screaming from nightmares, and hardened warriors go pale. Then, having made their point with brutal clarity, having demonstrated exactly what defiance would cost, Baiju calmly withdrew. Not because he was afraid of the Seljuk army gathering to respond, not because he lacked the strength to continue, because he was patient, because he understood psychology as well as tactics. He returned to winter quarters in the Muan plain and waited like a spider in its web. He knew with absolute certainty that Khusraw would have to respond to this provocation. He knew the Sultan's pride wouldn't let this massacre stand unavenged. And he knew that when the armies finally met on the battlefield, the outcome was already decided. The Seljuks just didn't know it yet. Khusraw, to his credit, understood the magnitude of the threat he now faced. He sent messengers racing across Anatolia and beyond, carrying urgent appeals for military aid. This wasn't just a Seljuk problem anymore. he argued. This was an existential threat to every Muslim power in the region, to Islamic civilization itself in Anatolia. He needed allies desperately, and he needed them fast. And remarkably, they came. The Empire of Trebizond, that Byzantine remnant clinging precariously to the Black Sea coast, sent valuable troops despite historical enmity. The Ayyubid Sultan in Aleppo, ruling over Syria and fearing Mongol expansion southward, dispatched experienced warriors. Frankish mercenaries, Christian knights from the Crusader states who fought for gold rather than God, joined the muster. Their plate armor and powerful war horses a welcome addition. Georgian nobles, bound by marriage alliances to the Seljuk royal family and fearing for their own independence, rode to war with their heavy cavalry. Even the Byzantine emperor in distant Constantinople, Manuel II, struggling with his own problems, offered encouraging words of support, if not actual soldiers. He couldn't spare troops from his own desperate situation, but he could send diplomatic support and prayers. By spring 1243, Khusra had assembled something truly impressive by medieval standards. 80,000 men, the largest army ever gathered in Anatolia. This wasn't some hastily assembled levy of terrified peasants clutching farming tools. This was a professional, multinational coalition with genuine military capability. Turkic cavalry, skilled horsemen with composite bows who formed the core of Seljuk military power, made up the center. These were veterans of border warfare, men who'd spent years fighting. Infantry from various beyliks, those semi-autonomous Turkish principalities, swelled the ranks with tens of thousands of foot soldiers. The Frankish knights brought their devastating heavy cavalry charges, the shock tactics that had won battles from Jerusalem to Antioch in the Crusades. The Georgians brought discipline, training, and combat experience. The Ayyubid Arabs brought desert fighting expertise and valuable knowledge of facing steppe nomads. It was a genuine coalition of the willing, united by shared fear of what would happen if the Mongols won and continued their conquests. But coalitions have a fatal, structural weakness that no amount of courage can overcome. They don't share a single language, a unified culture, or a coherent command structure that works smoothly under pressure. Khusra's massive army spoke literally a dozen different tongues: Turkish, Arabic, Georgian, Greek, Latin, Armenian. Complex orders had to be translated, retranslated, sometimes just guessed at or pantomimed. Communication was a nightmare. Some contingents owed genuine feudal loyalty to the Sultan. Others were mercenaries who'd switch sides without hesitation if the money was better elsewhere or if defeat looked certain. And the Turkmen tribal cavalry fierce fighters all had more in common culturally with the Mongols than with the urbanized Seljuks they supposedly served. They were nomads serving city dwellers. That tension would matter. Somewhere in those highlands, in one of those minor beyliks that had dutifully sent troops to the muster, was a family we should mention briefly. A man named Ertuğrul, leader of a small Kaya tribe, probably sent a few hundred warriors to this gathering. His holdings were modest, a few villages, some grazing land for his tribe's flocks near a place called Söğüt on the Byzantine frontier. Nobody paid him much attention at the time. Why would they? He was nobody important in the grand scheme. His tribe numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. He held no great cities, controlled no lucrative trade routes, possessed no legendary reputation. His grandson would be named Osman, and Osman would change the entire world, would build an empire from nothing. But in June 1243, the future was unwritten and invisible. The present was all that mattered. And the present was about to become a bloodbath that would echo through the next 6 centuries. The armies converged on a landscape that seemed designed by cruel gods to humble human ambition and mock human planning. Köse, the name means beardless mountain in Turkish, was a narrow pass east of the city of Sivas, threading through highlands where brutal summer heat turned the air to liquid copper and water sources were as scarce as mercy. To the north, mountains rose in stark brown ridges, beautiful in their harshness and utterly indifferent to the men about to die in their shadows. To the south, more mountains. Through the middle ran a valley just wide enough for large armies to maneuver and deploy, just narrow enough for clever generals to exploit with tactical brilliance. The terrain was classic cavalry country, open enough for horsemen to operate at speed, but with enough broken ground to create opportunities for ambush, maneuver, and tactical surprise. This terrain mattered far more than most soldiers realized at the time. In completely open steppe, the Mongols were virtually unstoppable. Their cavalry could wheel and feint and envelop with unlimited room to spare, executing those devastating tactics that had conquered half the known world. In narrow mountain passes, that advantage diminished somewhat. Disciplined infantry could theoretically hold choke points. Heavy cavalry could charge down valleys and crush lighter horsemen against the rocky slopes. Defenders with good defensive positions could potentially negate numerical disadvantages. Or so Khusraw's experienced generals argued. The smart ones, the veterans of decades fighting on these borderlands, who'd survived battles that killed lesser men. These hardened veterans strongly advocated for a purely defensive strategy. Let them come to us at Sivas, they urged the Sultan repeatedly. We have walls, water, ample supplies stored. Make them besiege us. Let them waste precious time and irreplaceable men on our defenses. Stretch their logistics to the breaking point. Wait for summer heat to do what our swords cannot kill horses. Spread disease. Demoralize troops. Force them to attack fortified positions on our terms, not theirs. It was sound, professional military advice, the kind that wins wars, save empire, makes commanders immortal in history books as strategic geniuses. Khusraw ignored it completely. The Sultan's younger advisors, nobles who'd never personally faced the Mongols in battle, who'd heard terrifying stories, but never smelled burning cities or seen populations marched into slavery, wanted glory instead of survival. They wanted a decisive, open battle, a crushing field victory, a triumph that would be sung about for generations in epic poems. They wanted to prove conclusively that civilized Seljuk warriors were superior to these steppe barbarians, that Islamic faith and urban civilization would triumph over nomadic raiders. They took only one of our cities. Khusraw reportedly said dismissively, Erzurum is one city among many. I have dozens of cities, hundreds of fortresses. We will meet them in the open field and destroy them where they stand like the dogs they are. Pride speaking. Youthful arrogance. The kind of hubris that makes historians wince painfully when they read the sources centuries later. So the Seljuk army marched out confidently from Konya, the magnificent capital, in late May 1243. 80,000 men on the move is a logistical nightmare that would challenge modern militaries with trucks and radios and GPS. For medieval armies, it was an almost insurmountable organizational challenge. The columns stretched for miles. Accounts suggest it took most of an entire day for the complete army to pass a given point. Cavalry rode ahead proudly, scouting the route and foraging from villages. Infantry trudged in the sweltering center, feet blistering in the heat, armor weighing heavier with each step under the relentless sun. Massive baggage trains creaked along in the rear with supplies and camp followers, merchants, prostitutes, cooks, servants, wives, children, all the human detritus that medieval armies inevitably accumulated. The army ate its way through the countryside like a locust swarm, requisitioning food from terrified villages, paying when they remembered to, taking by force when they didn't. Local populations watched the Sultan's host march past with deeply mixed emotions. Relief that these hungry troops weren't staying in their villages. Fear of what would happen if they lost to the Mongols. Hope that maybe this massive army would finally eliminate the Mongol threat forever. They covered roughly 320 kilometers in stages, marching for a few hours each morning before the heat became completely unbearable, resting through the scorching afternoon, marching again in the cooler evening. The pace was agonizingly slow. It took weeks. By late June, they'd finally reached the approaches to Kosa Da and found the pass eerily empty. Baiju had gotten there first, with his smaller, faster force, but he'd withdrawn deliberately. His scouts had been watching the Seljuk advance for days, shadowing the columns from the hills like wolves, counting numbers precisely, noting composition, reporting everything back to their general. When Khusraw's vanguard reached the pass on June 25th, they found Mongol campfires still warm, horse droppings fresh, but no army visible anywhere. Some of the Sultan's men actually celebrated. They fled, went the excited cry through the camp. They saw our numbers and ran like cowardly dogs. The great Mongols are nothing but barbarian cowards after all. The smart generals, the experienced ones, knew better with cold certainty. Mongols didn't flee. They maneuvered with purpose. They positioned deliberately. They chose ground carefully. And somewhere out there, just beyond visual range in the hills, 30,000 Mongol cavalry were preparing a trap with mechanical precision. That night, the last night before the battle, the last night many men would ever see the two armies camped within a few miles of each other, though the Seljuks didn't know exactly where their enemy had positioned. In Khusraw's camp, the atmosphere was strange, electric with tension and false confidence mixed together. Some men prayed earnestly, performing the ancient rituals that had sustained soldiers for centuries. Muslims faced Mecca and whispered verses from the Quran, asking Allah for strength and victory and mercy. Christians among the mercenaries made the sign of the cross and commended their souls to God. Preparing for possible death, Georgians sang low hymns in their guttural language, songs of faith and battle that had been old when their grandfathers were young. Others drank heavily. The Frankish knights especially drained wineskins and boasted loudly about what they'd do to the Mongols tomorrow. "We've faced horse archers before in the Crusades," they claimed with alcohol-fueled bravado. "Just ride them down hard. Once we close the distance, their bows are useless. They can't stand against a proper nightly charge. We'll scatter them like chaff before wind." They had absolutely no idea what was coming. None of them did. In the Mongol camp, the mood was completely different. Quiet, professional, almost serene. An eerie silence reigned, broken only by the purposeful sounds of methodical preparation. These were professional soldiers who'd campaigned from Hungary to Korea, who'd seen more battles than most men see sunrises, who'd won every major engagement for decades. They didn't need motivational speeches or emotional appeals to courage. They knew their deadly business, like master craftsmen know their tools. They checked their bowstrings carefully in the firelight, testing tension, replacing any that showed even slight wear. They ran whetstones methodically along their sabers, the distinctive curved blades that could take a man's head off with one powerful swing. They adjusted their lamellar armor, overlapping metal scales that provided surprising protection while maintaining the flexibility necessary for horseback archery. Each warrior carried exactly 60 arrows in 2 quivers, 30 on each hip. Each arrow had been personally inspected that evening. Each bow had been tested. Each horse had been carefully checked for lameness, fed, and watered. Baiju walked quietly among his men, speaking in low tones with his commanders, men who'd served with him for years, who could anticipate his orders before he gave them, who understood his tactical language. The plan was simple. Mongol plans always were. Simplicity works in the chaos of battle. When complicated schemes fall apart, let the enemy attack first. Use superior mobility to avoid their charges. Shoot them to pieces with arrows from beyond their effective range. When they inevitably break, and they will break, pursue and destroy without mercy. 30,000 warriors against 80,000 sounded like suicidal madness to anyone who didn't understand how the Mongols fought. But these men had conquered half the known world with exactly these tactics. They'd destroyed armies twice, 3 times their size repeatedly. Numbers didn't intimidate them. Numbers just meant more targets, more bodies to add to the count, more proof of Mongol superiority. The Mongol force composition was brutally efficient, honed by decades of constant conquest. The core was heavy cavalrymen in lamellar armor on armored horses, carrying composite bows, sabers, and lances. These weren't the lightly armored steppe raiders of popular imagination, the primitive horse barbarians from Hollywood movies. These were elite shock troops who could shoot accurately from horseback at full gallop and also charge home in devastating close combat like European knights. Supporting them were lighter horse archers, less heavily armored but faster, more agile, used for harassment and relentless pursuit. They'd sweep around enemy flanks, pepper them with arrows, retreat when threatened, return when the enemy tired. Mongol battles were exhausting marathons of maneuver, not quick sprints of heroic charges. And then there were the auxiliaries, Armenian and Georgian contingents who'd been conquered years earlier and now fought for their Mongol masters. These Christians knew the terrain intimately, spoke the local languages, and provided invaluable intelligence. They also served as expendable shock troops when needed, absorbing casualties that preserved precious Mongol core units. The Mongols also had a psychological weapon. The Seljuks couldn't match experience and absolute confidence born from that experience. Every single man in Baiju's army had fought in multiple campaigns. They'd besieged cities, crossed burning deserts, survived brutal winters that killed horses and weak men. They'd seen their tactics work again and again and again against every imaginable enemy. They didn't doubt. They didn't fear. They didn't question orders. They just waited professionally for the killing to start, as calm as butchers waiting for livestock to arrive. Kai Khusraw's army, in stark contrast, was a grab bag of different military traditions that had never trained together, that barely spoke the same language, that had competing and contradictory ideas about how battles should be fought. The Turkic cavalry fought in a style somewhat similar to the Mongols, but less refined, less coordinated, less rigorously disciplined. They were good. The Mongols were simply better. The infantry levies from the beyliks were barely trained peasants with spears brave enough, certainly, but lacking the skill to stand effectively against professional cavalry. The Frankish knights were brave and individually skilled, but tactically rigid, locked into Western European tactics of frontal charges that worked great against other knights, but had fatal weaknesses against mobile horse archers. The Georgians were probably the best troops in the entire Seljuk army, but few in number. The Ayyubid Arabs were experienced in desert warfare, not mountain pass battles, and commanding this polyglot, multilingual force was a sultan who'd never fought the Mongols, surrounded by advisors who confused enthusiasm with expertise, who mistook numbers for strength, who thought courage could substitute for strategy and experience. As dawn approached on June 26th, the temperature was already climbing ominously. This would be a brutally hot day, the kind of Anatolian summer heat that makes armor burn exposed skin, that makes men desperate for water, that turns minor wounds into fatal infections, that kills as surely as swords and arrows. The sky lightened gradually from black to gray to pale blue streaked with red. In the Seljuk camp, horns began to blow, different horns for different contingents, creating a discordant cacophony rather than a unified symphony. Commanders shouted orders in multiple languages simultaneously: Turkish, Arabic, Georgian, Greek, Latin, Armenian. Men scrambled to form ranks, to find their units, to ready weapons and nervous horses. The confusion was immense, chaotic, but somehow the massive army began to organize itself, drawn up in rough formations across the valley floor. Kai Khusraw called a final council just after sunrise. His generals gathered around him in the command tent, a space thick with tension and competing egos. The conservative Atabeg made one last desperate plea. Lord, we should hold our position here. Let them come to us. We have the numbers to form a defensive line they cannot break through. We can wear them down gradually, force them to attack fortified positions, make them pay in blood for every yard of ground. The young nobles shouted him down with the arrogant confidence of men who'd never seen real battle. We came here to fight. Are we cowards who hide behind walls? The men will think we're afraid. We have 80,000 warriors. We'll crush these barbarians and send their survivors running back to Mongolia. Kai Khusraw made his decision, the decision that would doom an empire, We attack today. We'll drive them back to wherever they came from and teach them that Anatolia belongs to the Seljuks now and forever. The die was cast. The decision was made. There would be no turning back now. The army began to move, a great beast of men and horses and steel, stumbling forward toward its own destruction. And in the Mongol camp, scouts watched through the morning haze and reported to Baiju with professional detachment. They're coming. They're coming in disorder with no proper formation. Their line is ragged. Their flanks are exposed. Baiju smiled a thin smile that never reached his cold eyes. This would be easier than he'd thought. Position the men, he ordered calmly. Let them come. Let them tire themselves marching in this heat. Then we'll show them what happens when amateurs face professionals. The Seljuk army advanced toward the pass where they expected to find the Mongols waiting. Instead, they found them on rising ground to the northeast, already formed for battle, waiting with that terrible Mongol patience that had conquered empires. It was time. Time for 80,000 men to learn that numbers meant nothing against tactics. Time for an empire to die. Time for history to turn on its axis. The sound came first before the violence, before the blood, before the world came apart. A low thunder of 80,000 men moving forward simultaneously, metal jangling against metal, horses snorting clouds of steam in the morning air, boots crushing dry grass that crunched like breaking bones. The smell followed close behind dust and sweat and the acrid tang of fear barely masked by perfume and bravado. Leather heated by climbing sun. The organic reek of men packed too close together. Horse dung and human waste and the oil used to maintain weapons and armor. And then the visual spectacle, two armies spreading across a valley floor like storms about to collide. Banners rippling in hot wind. Sunlight catching on tens of thousands of spear points and sword blades until the whole Seljuk line glittered like a river of steel flowing toward its fate. The Mongols waited motionless on higher ground, silent as statues carved from stone. 30,000 horsemen in precise formations. Not a wasted movement. Not a sound beyond horses stamping and the occasional jingle of harness. Their composite bows were strung and ready. Their quivers were full, each man carrying 60 arrows that would soon darken the sky. Their discipline was absolute, inhuman, terrifying to anyone who understood what it meant. Gai Husrau sat his horse in the center of the Seljuk line, surrounded by his personal guard in their finest armor, men who'd sworn sacred oaths to die for their sultan, who'd soon have that oath tested. His plan, such as it was straightforward to the point of dangerous simplicity. Advance in overwhelming force. Crush the Mongols through sheer weight of men and metal. The Frankish knights on the right wing were eager, already spurring forward, impatient for glory and the rich rewards that came with it. The Turkic cavalry in the center formed the main body, thousands of horsemen with composite bows and sabers. The Georgians held the left, professional and grim-faced. Infantry filled the gaps between cavalry units. 80,000 men advancing. It looked unstoppable. It looked like destiny itself. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But before the main armies even engaged, before the great collision of cavalry masses that everyone expected, Disaster struck from an unexpected direction, from within the Seljuk ranks themselves. One of the Seljuk nobles, young, ambitious, commanding about 20,000 men on the right wing, couldn't wait for coordinated orders. Sources don't even agree on his name, which is fitting because his reckless decision would doom thousands of men whose names are also lost to history. He saw the Mongol line, saw what he thought was numerical inferiority, saw his chance for immortal glory, for songs and honors, and wealth beyond imagination. Without orders from the Sultan, without coordination with other units, without even basic tactical sense, he launched his own unauthorized charge. 20,000 men broke ranks and surged forward in a chaotic wave, racing toward the Mongol right wing like a tsunami of steel and fury and misplaced confidence. The Frankish knights enthusiastically joined them, lances lowered, armor blazing in the sun, convinced that one good charge would scatter these horsemen like the Arab cavalry they'd faced in the Crusades. For a moment, watching from the main Seljuk line, it must have looked glorious. Cavalry thundering across the valley at full speed, dust rising behind them like smoke from a great fire, sunlight glinting off armor. Victory seemingly inevitable. Triumph just minutes away. The Mongols did what they always did, what they'd done 1,000 times before from the Danube to the Yellow River. They retreated. Not in panic, not in disorder, not like beaten men fleeing for their lives. In perfect formation, as coordinated as a flock of birds wheeling in the sky, the Mongol right wing wheeled and galloped away from the charging Seljuks. Their horses were fresh, carefully fed and watered that morning. Their riders were expert horsemen who'd learned to ride before they could walk. They opened the distance easily, staying just out of lance range, just beyond where the charging Seljuks could catch them. And as they rode, they twisted in their saddles and shot backward. The Parthian shot the steppe archer's signature move, riding away from the enemy while putting arrows into them with devastating accuracy. It looks impossible. It requires years of daily practice. The Mongols made it look easy. The first Seljuk horseman to close the distance took arrows in the face, in the throat, in the gaps between armor plates, where leather joints connected pieces of steel. Men toppled from saddles dead before they hit the ground. Horses screamed and went down thrashing, throwing riders who were trampled by those behind, bones breaking under iron-shod hooves. But the charge continued, momentum carrying it forward like a stone rolling downhill. Impossible to stop. The attackers were convinced they had the Mongols on the run, convinced that victory was just ahead, just a few more yards, just a bit farther. They charged deeper into the valley, farther from the main Seljuk line, farther from support, farther from any hope of retreat or rescue. And then the Mongol wings closed, like the jaws of a trap springing shut. From the left and right, Mongol cavalry units that had been hidden in dead ground or held in reserve suddenly appeared, moving with mechanical precision. They wheeled inward, forming a horseshoe around the Seljuk attackers. The retreating Mongols stopped, turned on a copper coin, and rejoined the battle. In minutes, 20,000 Seljuks found themselves completely surrounded by Mongol horse archers, firing from every direction, from ranges where Seljuk bows couldn't effectively reach, but Mongol composite bows could kill with ease. It was a massacre dressed up as a battle. Arrows came in swarms, in clouds that literally darkened the air and made the sun dim. They fell like steel rain, punching through leather, finding seams in armor, dropping horses and men alike with mechanical efficiency. The Seljuks tried desperately to rally, tried to form defensive circles. But cavalry can't hold ground under that kind of sustained fire. The Mongol arrows didn't stop. Wave after wave, volley after volley. 60 arrows per warrior and 30,000 warriors meant nearly 2 million arrows potentially available. They didn't need all of them. Not even close. Men broke, ran, died running. The Frankish knights tried to charge out of the trap, tried to do what they did best, close with the enemy and fight hand to hand, where their armor and training would give them advantage. Their plate armor saved some from arrows, deflecting shots that would have killed lighter armored men. But the Mongols adjusted tactics on the fly, adapting like water flowing around obstacles. Shoot the horses? Not the riders. Once the knights were unhorsed, they were just exhausted men in 100-pound metal shells, stumbling around in the Anatolian sun, easy prey for light cavalry to swarm and finish with sabers and axes. It took less than 2 hours. By mid-morning, with the sun climbing toward its zenith and heat beginning to kill men as surely as weapons, 20,000 Seljuk soldiers were dead, captured, or fleeing in blind panic. 3,000 bodies littered that section of valley, already bloating in the heat, turning black, attracting flies and clouds so thick they looked like smoke. The survivors fled in all directions, panicked and broken, throwing away weapons and armor to run faster, thinking only of escape. And the main Seljuk army, still in formation, perhaps 2 miles away, had watched it happen, had stood paralyzed while a full quarter of their force was systematically destroyed in 2 hours. The psychological impact was devastating, crushing, absolute. These weren't peasant levies who'd been slaughtered. These were nobles, knights, trained cavalry, supposedly the best troops, gone in 2 hours. Khusrau should have retreated right then, should have withdrawn immediately to Sivas, regrouped behind walls, adopted the defensive strategy his smart generals had advocated from the start. But retreating after that disaster would look like panic, would look like defeat, would destroy morale completely and turn an army into a mob. So he ordered the advance to continue the worst possible decision. The main Seljuk army trudged forward, and the Mongols waited for them like patient predators. When the lines finally closed, when the two main armies actually engaged, the battle entered a new phase, different in character, but no less brutal. This was closer range fighting, too tight for the Mongols' usual mobility advantage, too chaotic for sophisticated tactics. The Seljuk infantry pushed forward with spears and shields, finally useful after hours of watching cavalry fight. The Turkish cavalry in the center clashed with Mongol heavy cavalry in swirling melees of saber and lance and pure murderous rage. For hours the battle was genuinely contested, ebbing and flowing, neither side gaining decisive advantage. The Georgian contingent on the Seljuk left distinguished themselves with courage that deserved a better fate. These were disciplined professional soldiers, veterans of border wars and dynastic struggles. They fought like demons, refusing to break, holding their ground against repeated Mongol attacks. They drove back multiple charges, held their formation, even counterattacked and pushed the Mongol left wing backward. For a brief shining moment, it seemed like the battle might turn, like the Georgians might punch through and roll up the Mongol line. But the Mongols had reserves, fresh troops rotating into the line. This was professional warfare, not heroic, but ruthlessly efficient. While the Georgians tired, while their horses flagged, while their arrows ran low, fresh Mongol units relieved exhausted ones. The Seljuks had no such rotation system, no such organization. Their men fought until they dropped from exhaustion. And as the afternoon wore on, as the sun climbed to its zenith and heat became another enemy more deadly than swords, Seljuk cohesion began to fracture like sun-baked clay. The smell of blood was overwhelming now, thick enough to taste, coppery and hot, mixed with the stench of opened bowels and the sweet rot of bodies already cooking in their armor as gases built up until corpses swelled grotesquely. Flies appeared in clouds so thick they sounded like wind, covering wounds, drinking blood, spreading disease. The ground grew slippery, with gore horses losing footing in mud made from earth and blood. Wounded men cried for water, for mercy, for their mothers in a dozen languages. The noise was constant and maddening, metal on metal, screams of pain and rage, horses shrieking with wounds, commanders shouting orders no one could hear through the chaos. And then came the betrayals that finished what the Mongols had started. The Turkmen cavalry contingents, those tribal warriors who'd always been semi-autonomous, who'd never fully accepted Seljuk authority, who remembered when they'd been independent, started defecting. In ones and twos at first, then in whole units of hundreds. They rode across to the Mongol lines, with hands raised in surrender or supplication. These Turkmen felt kinship with the Mongols, both peoples originating from the Central Asian steppes, both speaking related Turkic languages, both living by nomadic traditions that urban Seljuks had abandoned generations ago. The urban Seljuks had always looked down on them as half-civilized, barely better than bandits. Now they switched sides and took Seljuk military secrets with them. Each defection opened gaps in the Seljuk line. Each gap became a point for Mongol attacks to pour through like water through a cracking dam. The Khwarezmian mercenaries, those refugees who'd fled earlier Mongol conquests in Central Asia, who'd already lost everything once to these same enemies, knew exactly what fate awaited them if they were captured. They'd seen what the Mongols did to survivors of broken armies. They fled en masse, riding for the mountains, abandoning the battle entirely, thinking only of survival. The Seljuk center began to crumble slowly at first, then faster, then all at once. Kaikusra's personal guard, perhaps 2,000 heavy cavalry, sworn to protect their sultan with their lives, tried desperately to stem the collapse. They formed around the sultan's banner, a magnificent silk standard that had flown over victories for generations and prepared to make a final stand. They were brave men. History would record that. Their courage was utterly irrelevant. Mongol horse archers swarmed them, shooting from just out of sword range, maintaining distance with expert horsemanship. Men fell from saddles like fruit from shaken trees, bodies piling up around the banner. The standard itself took so many arrows it looked like a porcupine, so heavy with shafts that it drooped. The standard bearer died, then his replacement, then the next man, until no one would take the cursed banner, and it fell into the dust. Someone, probably one of his remaining generals, someone with enough sense to see the disaster, grabbed Khusraw's bridle and shouted something urgent. The exact words are lost to history, but the meaning was clear. We have to run now. Right now, or you'll die here. The Sultan's nerve broke completely. Whatever courage or pride had brought him to this battlefield evaporated like water on hot stone. He wheeled his horse and galloped toward the rear, toward safety, toward survival at any cost. His personal guard tried to follow, to shield his retreat with their bodies, but most were cut down within minutes. Mongol cavalry pursued, arrows flying, sabers flashing. Men died protecting a sultan who was already gone. Khusraw himself made it out of the killing zone by pure luck, a horse that didn't stumble, a gap in the Mongol line, arrows that missed by inches. He rode hard for Sivas, didn't stop at Sivas, kept riding through the night, rode all the way to Konya, kept riding to Antalya on the coast, as far from the Mongols as Anatolia allowed. He'd survive. His empire wouldn't. The Seljuk army collapsed like a house of cards, like a dam breaking, like any structure when its foundation fails. Without the Sultan's banner to rally around, without leadership, without hope, 80,000 men became a terrified mob of individuals trying desperately not to die. Some units held together and retreated in good order. The Georgians managed this through pure discipline, fighting their way out in a withdrawal that the Mongols noted with professional respect. Most just ran, throwing away weapons and armor, thinking only of escape. The Mongols pursued, but carefully. Baiju had fought enough battles to know that running down a routed army could be more dangerous than the battle itself. Scattered soldiers could regroup. Ambushes could be laid. Terrain could favor desperate defenders. Exhausted cavalry could be vulnerable. As darkness fell, as shadows lengthened across the valley of death, he called off the pursuit. Let them run. Let them carry stories of what happened here. Let terror do the work that arrows started. Night settled over Köseda. The battle was over. The killing continued. The wounded lay where they'd fallen, scattered across miles of valley floor like discarded dolls. They cried out in a dozen languages, each man calling for help that would never come. Some begged for water, throats raw from screaming and dust. Some called names of friends or relatives, hoping someone would find them. Some just moaned animal sounds of pain that had no words, no meaning beyond suffering. As temperatures dropped from day's heat to night's chill, many simply died of shock and exposure, their bodies giving up. Scavengers appeared, locals from nearby villages, camp followers from both armies, anyone brave or desperate enough to venture onto the field. They moved among the bodies, stripping armor, taking jewelry, rifling through pockets for coins or valuables. They finished off men too wounded to resist mercy killings that weren't particularly merciful, but at least ended suffering. The moon rose over a landscape transformed into hell, silver light painting everything in shades of gray that hid the worst of the blood. Bodies sprawled everywhere, thousands upon thousands, already starting to swell in the heat. Horses lay dead or dying, their enormous bulk making them landmarks in the carnage. Broken weapons littered the ground, making walking treacherous. Blood soaked into the earth until the dirt turned to reddish mud that would stain boots for weeks. Flies swarmed in clouds so thick they sounded like wind. Baiju's men set up camp just beyond the battlefield, far enough to avoid the worst of the smell, but close enough to guard against counterattack. They'd taken losses. Estimates suggest 2,000 to 3,000 dead or wounded, but nothing catastrophic. Nothing that would prevent them from continuing operations. They'd destroyed an army 3 times their size. They'd shattered the most powerful state in Anatolia. Tomorrow they'd begin following up on their victory, pursuing the Sultan, securing their conquest. Tonight, they rested professional soldiers who'd done their jobs well. In the Seljuk camp, or what remained of it, survivors stumbled in throughout the night. Men who'd run in all directions and somehow found their way back. Units that had managed to retreat intact, their numbers decimated, but organization maintained. The atmosphere was pure shock, collective trauma, on a scale that broke men's minds as surely as the battle had broken their army. How had this happened? 80,000 men had marched out that morning. Maybe 30,000 returned, and that's a generous estimate. The rest were dead, captured, or fleeing through the mountains. Khusraw reached Konya, then kept running to Antalya on the coast, as far from the Mongols as Anatolia allowed. His army was destroyed. His reputation was shattered. His empire was dying. And in the mountains, in the Beylik principalities that had contributed troops to the disaster, men drew their own conclusions. The Seljuk Sultanate was finished. The Mongols were unstoppable. The old order was dead. What came next was anyone's guess. But in that uncertainty, in that chaos, in that complete collapse of authority, opportunity lurked for men ambitious enough and ruthless enough to seize it. The aftermath of Khusraw was brutal and humiliating. When Khusraw's delegation finally caught up with Baiju's advancing army near Sivas, the Mongols were methodically occupying major cities, meeting no resistance. The terms they negotiated were crushingly harsh. The Sultanate would pay annual tribute, massive quantities of gold, silk, horses, and slaves. The amounts would bankrupt the treasury. Half of the Sultanate's territory would be occupied by Mongol garrisons. Mongol officials would be stationed in every major city to oversee tax collection and enforce compliance. The Sultan himself would remain in power, but only as a puppet. Real authority belonged to the Mongols. Coins minted after Khusraw tell the story without words. Earlier Seljuk coins proudly proclaimed the Sultan's name and titles. Post-1243 coins carried vague, submissive legends, no boasts, no claims of power. Just prayers from a dynasty that had been emasculated in a single afternoon. The Mongols weren't interested in directly ruling Anatolia. They had an empire stretching from Korea to Poland. They installed garrisons, collected tribute, and otherwise let local administration continue. But that light-touch occupation was almost worse than direct conquest. It created a power vacuum, a political situation where authority was unclear and therefore contestable. The Seljuk sultans had authority on paper but no real power to enforce decisions. The Mongols had power but no interest in governing day-to-day affairs. Into that vacuum stepped ambitious men who saw opportunity in chaos. Throughout the 1240s and 1250s, local strongmen began carving out their own territories, building their own power bases. These beyliks principalities were technically still part of the Seljuk Sultanate, but in practice, they were independent little kingdoms with their own armies and ambitions. One of these beyliks deserves our attention because it would change everything. Near a town called Söğüt, on the frontier between Seljuk Anatolia and Byzantine territories, a man named Ertuğrul led a small tribal group. His holdings were modest, a few villages, some grazing land. His followers numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. He was nobody important. In the chaos after Köse, he'd managed to secure his position by raiding Byzantine territories and bringing back loot. Ertuğrul had a son named Osman. We don't know much about Osman's early years, but we know he grew up in that post-Köse world of fragmentation and opportunity. He grew up watching the Seljuk Sultanate disintegrate in slow motion. He grew up on the Byzantine frontier, where aggressive warriors could raid weakened Christian territories and build power through conquest. He grew up in a world where the old rules didn't apply anymore, where ambition and military skill mattered more than noble birth. The Byzantines themselves were in no position to resist anyone. They'd been shattered by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, briefly erased when Crusaders conquered Constantinople itself. They barely controlled territory beyond their capital's walls. Perfect conditions for an ambitious warlord to rise from nothing to something. Throughout the 1250s and 1260s, the Seljuk Sultanate existed in name only, a zombie state animated by Mongol puppetry. Different sultans claimed the throne. The Mongols executed some, installed others, switched them out when convenient. The political situation was utterly chaotic, perfect for opportunists. Then in 1335, the Ilkhanate, the Mongol state that ruled Persia and controlled Anatolia, collapsed in civil war. Suddenly, the Mongol garrisons in Anatolia withdrew. The overlords were gone. Anatolia was free from Mongol control. But free just meant completely fragmented. The Seljuk Sultanate ended not with a dramatic fall, but with a whimper. The last sultan vanished from historical records sometime in the early 1300s. What replaced it? A dozen competing beyliks, none strong enough to reunify Anatolia. One of them was led by Osman, Ertuğrul's son. His beylik was small, poor, seemingly insignificant. He ruled maybe a few thousand people, controlled maybe a few hundred square miles. Nothing impressive. Within a century, his descendants would conquer Constantinople and terrify Europe. Within 2 centuries, they'd rule an empire from Algeria to Iraq, from Hungary to Yemen. The Mongols had destroyed the Seljuk order at Köse. They had no idea they'd just created the conditions for the Ottoman Empire to be born. Think about the modern parallels, because Köse teaches lessons that echo today. Think about overconfidence. Khusrau had 3-1 numerical advantage, assumed victory. Modern, every underestimated enemy. Vietnam, Afghanistan. Numbers don't guarantee victory. Think about coalition weakness. Multilingual army, no unified command. Modern, every coalition. NATO struggles, coalitions of the willing. Unity matters. Think about the feigned retreat. Mongols pretended to run, then encircled. Modern, every tactical deception. Finds, misdirection. Think about defections. Turkmen switch sides mid-battle. Modern, every civil war. Syria, Libya. Loyalties shift. Think about puppet states. Seljuks became Mongol vassals. Modern, every client regime. Vietnam, Afghanistan. Puppets lack legitimacy. Think about power vacuums. Mongol control created fragmentation. Modern Iraq, Libya, Syria. Removing strongmen creates chaos. Think about unintended consequences. Destroying Seljuks birthed Ottomans. Modern, every intervention. Afghanistan versus Soviets created Taliban. Blowback. Think about long-term effects. Battle in 1243 shaped empires for 600 years. Modern Sykes-Picot still affects Middle East. Decisions echo through centuries. So what's the final lesson of Kuseda? It's this: destruction creates opportunity. The Mongols won completely, achieved every objective, established their dominance. And in doing so, they planted seeds they never intended. They cleared space. They broke the old order so completely that something new could grow in the ruins. The Ottoman Empire rose because the Mongols destroyed the Seljuks. The destroyers created the successors. The conquerors gave birth to an empire greater than their own. That's the supreme irony. The Mongols won the battle but lost the future. They came to impose order. They created chaos. And from that chaos emerged an empire that lasted 600 years, until 1922, until the modern era. Great empires often create their own successors through destruction. Rome's fall created medieval kingdoms that became modern European states. The Mongol destruction of the Islamic Middle East created space for new Islamic powers, the greatest being the Ottomans. Sometimes, empires are like forest fires. They clear ground so greater trees can grow. Today, if you visit Kuseda, you won't find much. Turkish farmers plow fields where 80,000 men gathered in June 1243. There are no monuments. History forgot the battle that changed everything. But the consequences live on, echo through centuries, shape the world we inhabit. Modern Turkey exists partly because of what happened at Kuseda. European identity was shaped by centuries of Ottoman pressure. The Mongols won, and in winning, they lost. They broke an empire. In doing so, they forged the weapon that would build a greater one. If this exploration of history's greatest irony taught you something, subscribe to Maproom Battles. Comment, what's the most ironic consequence in military history? Thanks for studying how destruction creates empires. Remember, the battle nobody remembers created the empire everybody knows. Learn from Kuseda.